Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So Anand, again, New York Times. I think we took a little shit for your institution twice today now. What are you seeing in your travels? What are you hearing today and in our own session as well? Because you're like Taya coming in at the end of the formation, seeing it all come together. So what are you seeing?
Well, unlike these amazing women, I'm not an innovator myself, but I often report on people who are thinking afresh about things. And the great privilege of what I do is getting to go to all kinds of different places and in a way cross-pollinate them. And so places like Nigeria, excuse me, places like India and China, Brazil. I'm writing a book right now about the kind of backwaters of Texas. So I spent a lot of time there last year. And when you sent me this unexpected innovation theme, I kind of thought about it two ways. Where am I seeing innovation in unexpected places? But also, where am I seeing problems in these travels where we actually ought to expect innovation, but people like the people in this room can't be interested in those problems? And since we are in this room, I thought it would be particularly useful to talk about what are the kinds of problems out there that I'm seeing in places like the backwaters of Texas or Nigeria that could really use your intellect and your skills, but which often fail to interest people like us. So one kind of overall observation, first of all, which is that one of the things that's great in the developing world today that has happened fairly recently is people like the people in this room, which I'm going to keep using as a shorthand, in India, in China, in Brazil, have become very interested in large-scale social problems. In some ways because governments tend to be super dysfunctional in those countries, so there's very little hope that the government will ever solve problems like that. In part because it's kind of 80 or 90% of the people who have very hard lives in those countries, not 30 or 40 or 50%. And so on questions like how do poor people make payments? How do you deal with the debt cycle? How do you deal with affordability of heart surgery? You actually have a lot more smart people interested in those problems in poor countries than you do here, even though we have an enormous poor population, an enormous population that struggles with very hard lives. So just to pick three issues which all of your talents would be very useful for. We have an enormous problem with people living on a treadmill of debt in this country. And the only people who work on this problem, as far as I can tell, are predatory people. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know if anybody in this room works on that problem. Great.
Bam! Next.
There we go.
Sorted.
Conference successful.
What else you got? We just solved debt. Come on now. Katie London with a game.
That was quite amazing. But that was a plant, though, I have to admit. I hate it when there's not one. A lot of this gun conversation, which the country's having right now, I mean, I may be very naive about this, but at some level, the entire conversation's about, can we get 55% to support an assault weapons ban, or 53, or 58? And it seems to me if any of the kinds of technologies that you all develop were applied to guns, maybe we could invent guns that satisfy all the NRA's concerns about people being able to use your guns, but couldn't be used by other people, couldn't be used in various situations because of all kinds of different technological things that are possible today. But again, people like us tend not to be very interested in how do you make better rifles.
By the way, that came up in Hunger Games. So if anybody's still reading that series, like very personalized weaponry, fingerprint triggered, yeah.
So another area which interests me a lot, and again, there's some great work. The MIT has a lab doing this, is old age. And thinking about a period that is only going to get longer and longer as we advance technologically. We don't really know what to do with this 20, 30, 40, it's going to perhaps be 50, 60-year period beyond the time we have a very clear use for people and the time people die. And people are unhealthy. We don't know how to pay for this from a governmental point of view. People are lonely. We don't know how to make use of this surplus of lonely people to maybe help poor inner city kids who don't have enough parent time. And I think there could be a whole wave of innovation. So many of our social and particularly fiscal problems are connected to basically this problem of old age and health. But again, you don't feel the kind of energy around those. The kinds of people who I see solving that problem in public are, senators from Wisconsin. And I want to see people like you thinking about how we reinvent old age. I think there's a lot of interesting innovation which doesn't get thought of as an innovation in the field of what I do in writing. I think there are a lot of writers in particular who are trying to push past the old boundaries of writing about places for one place, writing about foreign countries for New York or for London. There's a lot more, and this was a bit discussed in the Wikipedia conversation, there's a bit more of a movement towards kind of reference point-free writing. And narrative nonfiction books that kind of write about a particular place so zoomed in that it could be for the people in that city, could be for the people in that country, but it's not extractive colonial writing anymore. And I actually think I don't think it's come into newspapers as much as it's mostly something happening in books. I actually think this is an enormously important frontier of innovation that particularly newspapers need to figure out. How do you cover countries in a way that doesn't, as it so often has in the past, make everybody in that country feel exploited and misunderstood? And the last thing I'll mention, which again doesn't fit the normal definition of innovation, but Tricia and I have had some conversations about this. In developing countries in particular, there is a lot of very exciting innovation and conversation around what it means to be modern today. And a lot of kind of what I would call post-Tom Friedman, post-world is flat thinking around modernity being a complicated thing that is a more local definition than the old definitions of it's this much privatization and it's this much share of foreign trade and it's this percentage of urban population. And a lot of interesting thinking in China in particular, in my experience, of people saying, maybe being modern is allowing the full flourishing of our people, but rethinking pretty basic things. And the Chinese are rethinking things that we don't like democracy, but achieving results that many of us would envy with their system that we loathe. But also in a variety of other places that I think have gotten out of a kind of Cold War paradigm of how do we become like a successful society, treating that as for granted, and how do we invent our own definition of a successful society.
Damn. I feel like no one should say anything. That was so beautiful, but I just ruined it by saying that. Any reaction from you guys to those thoughts or other things? We have about 5 minutes left total, just so everyone knows. Yeah, go ahead.
I think on the violence thing, it's interesting. I was talking to someone last week who runs this really amazing organization called Cure Violence, used to be called Ceasefire, and this guy is based out of Chicago. He started as an immunologist, so he studied infectious disease. And, working in Africa on infectious disease, on things like TB and malaria, he came back to the States, and he had this idea that we were sort of talking about earlier. The U.S. doesn't have any problems. What am I going to do here? They don't need doctors. And he looked at patterns of violence, and he realized that violence spreads in the exact same patterns that infectious disease spreads in. And so then he went about trying to treat violence in the ways that people go about trying to treat infectious disease. And he developed this intervention of people called violence interrupters. And these are people that are sent to communities to actually disrupt violence. And they're not the the police force, which would normally have that kind of role, because communities obviously don't trust the police and they don't want to get their folks in trouble. And so this is this new kind of citizen sector-based innovation that I think is incredible. And I think there are more and more examples of these kinds of solutions that haven't been democratized because we don't know about them and there's not a market. And when I talk about social entrepreneurship or try and write about it, my publishers tell me that my advance will be lower if I do that, because there's not a demand for it, or they don't think the market skews in that direction. But I think people are working on these things. It just, the infrastructure for democratizing a lot of these kinds of solutions don't exist.
Following up on that, I've been fascinated by the notion of cultural infrastructure, and exactly what you're talking about there, which is what do we need? That's a cultural issue, which is that people are saying social entrepreneurship is not important, there isn't a demand for it, and yet when you talk to some of the largest corporations, they're saying the most innovative solutions are happening from the social entrepreneurs and not from the traditional entrepreneurs, or from the ones that we're more familiar with in this room. And that's a culture issue. So what kinds of things do we need for our institutions, and what kinds of thinking do we need for so many people in this room, and particularly the journalists who are going to be sending out these memes, that these elements that will be part of what I think of as a cultural infrastructure, to support the changes that are already happening and support them so that they can spread more quickly.
I think that's amazing. Just quickly, and it's really about when we were looking at those comment feeds and saying, oh, how can I get involved on this issue, and that the only opportunity you had was a comment. And so it's about how do we actually create these ways of capturing really cool experiments that we're doing and sharing them. And I used to work at Ashoka, and we talked about a lot about this ladder of engagement and how you build people from interested readers or enthusiasts into change makers, and what that looks like. And you need more of this kind of infrastructure and the tools where people can start solar experiments in their backyard or those kinds of things.
Yes. One of the things in your conversation you think about is who are we talking to here, right? So like the gun manufacturers thing is actually a really interesting example. There's a lot of, I think, solutions we can think of about that, but we don't have gun makers here or industrial people here at all, really.
Or even anyone from the NRA.
Or anybody from the NRA, or even a lot, massive people who work on deck. So the problem becomes like a matter of scale, right? How do we scale this meeting up to an effective level where we can attract lots of these different people from different areas? So we need like almost like a CES for social, but it'd be much more fun if it was more like Comic-Con than CES.
But I would think about it. I mean, that's a part of it, conference design. But I think the problem goes beyond the conference. How many of us, forget this one gathering, because one gathering can't do it all. How many of us in the next 365 days will have dinner with an NRA member? There are a lot of NRA members, right? Right, but it goes to something larger in the country, which is a division. But I think you all don't necessarily realize how extraordinarily your talents differentiate you from 99% of the people in this society who may have various feelings about this, but can't solve the problems in the way you can. And so the problems you guys become interested in becomes very significant for everybody else. And I mean, it's one of the reasons we have the CTO of the Obama campaign. I mean, my sense is just culturally, for the next long time, the Democrats are going to have better CTOs than the Republicans. And that's just because the kind of people who want to do that overwhelmingly in these circles are Democrats. And so how does that apply to all kinds of issues, whether it's guns or debt or anything else?
I don't know that I agree with you at all on this issue about the
Yes!
I mean, the idea that somehow people who are technically savvy and understand how to build things and understand social are overwhelmingly liberal or progressive, I think is absolutely flawed. If you look at for a long time, the fastest growing segment of Meetup was always on the conservative side, and I think that it doesn't take very long for people to be able to pull or pay, and there's many people who are comfortable being hired guns, and they can be apolitical in that way. So I think that's a bias.
Just to follow up on the second point, it's worth noting that the conversation in the last decade was why are the conservatives so much better at blogging than the liberals around the war blogging in the lead up to the Iraq War. And it's worth noting that the Tea Party has had considerably more effect on the American public than Occupy did in roughly in the same period even that Occupy existed. the Tea Party being more imaginative and ultimately politically more effective use of those tools.
So I talked to hundreds and hundreds of engineers that we're hiring. There's very specific type of engineers. I talked to maybe 2 Republicans and maybe 25 to 30-ish libertarians, and the rest were Democrats. So although my gut is that that's absolutely true, that doesn't make sense that non-progressives would be worse at building things or tech. My experience absolutely does not demonstrate that. And it literally was, everyone I talked to was very excited about working for Democrats. And if you look at the Republicans, they barely could hire engineers to come in. They had to pay them lots of money, or I mean the Republicans. And so that's something that I think there is a difference there. I don't know if it's...
I mean, we could do a poll in the room.
Well, and I think also what's happening, because I would say let's defer further conversation on this to drinks, dinner, lines for the bathroom, elevators, subway hand-holding, because you don't want to touch the subway itself because it's foul. But there's some distinction on this topic between engineers and people who use social and people who direct movements and apply the power of the tool to a problem versus defining the tool. And those engineers are a very unique breed of human, and distinct from people who master blogging as a platform that's applied to getting a message out. So I want to thank all of y'all, especially for coming in, many of you into town. Thank you guys. And I think for me, this is much more beautiful than I thought. We had some really good sprinkles and stabbings and disagreements on what innovation even is, much less where it can happen. And I think as long as we keep a very wide lens on both of those, we can start to think, especially as Anand floats in on the tail of the diamond, about expanding the application of both those terms. Thank you.